When 73-year-old Denise Washington didn't answer her door for 3 days straight, her neighbors in the quiet suburb of Millbrook assumed she was visiting family. 15 years later, a routine basement renovation would reveal the horrifying truth about what really happened to the beloved grandmother that October morning in 2009. But before we dive into this incredible story, I'd love to know, where are you listening from today? Whether you're at home, commuting, or anywhere in between, please share in the comments. It's wonderful connecting with all of you through these stories, and I truly appreciate you being here. Picture this. It's early 2009, and Denise Washington is the heart and soul of Maple Street in suburban Chicago. Every single morning at 6:30 a.m. sharp, you could set your watch by Denise stepping onto her front porch with a steaming cup of coffee, tending to her famous rose garden that made the whole neighborhood envious. Denise wasn't just any neighbor. She was the neighbor. The one who brought homemade soup when someone was sick, who organized community barbecues, who knew every child's name and every family's story. At 73, she had more energy than people half her age and a laugh that could brighten anyone's day. She'd lived in that same mint green house for 42 years, watching generations grow up, families move in and out, and the neighborhood evolve around her. Her husband Raymond had passed 7 years earlier, but Denise refused to slow down. She volunteered at the local food bank, sang in the church choir, and somehow still found time to maintain the most spectacular garden on the block. But here's what made Denise truly special. She had this incredible gift for remembering everything about everyone. She knew when Mrs. Johnson's diabetes was acting up before Mrs. Johnson did. She could predict when the Thompson teenagers were about to get into trouble just by their body language. And she never, ever missed her morning routine. That's why what happened on October 15th, 2009, sent immediate shockwaves through the neighborhood. For the first time in decades, Denise's morning coffee ritual didn't happen. Her front porch remained empty, her roses went unwatered, and the entire neighborhood felt like something was terribly, terribly wrong. Terrell Washington knew his mother better than anyone. When he got the frantic call from concerned neighbors on October 17, after 3 full days of silence from his mother, he immediately canceled his work meetings and drove straight to Maple Street. The front door was unlocked, which wasn't unusual in their tight-knit community. Denise's purse sat on the kitchen counter, her wallet still containing over $300 in cash. Her reading glasses were folded neatly on the coffee table next to a half-finished crossword puzzle. Her bed looked slept in, but barely disturbed. But here's where things got strange, and this detail will become absolutely crucial to our story. A small weekend bag was missing from Denise's closet, along with some clothes and toiletries, the kind of bag you'd pack for a short trip. Terrell searched through his mother's meticulously organized calendar, looking for any mention of travel plans. Nothing. He called every family member, every church friend, every person in Denise's extensive social network. Nobody knew about any trip. That's when Terrell talked to the neighbors, and one person's story would change everything. It would turn out to be the most important lie ever told on Maple Street, a lie that would torture a family for 15 years. Charles Chuck Mitchell, the 62-year-old retired teacher who lived directly next to Denise, claimed he saw her leaving on October 15 around 7 p.m. According to Chuck, Denise had waved to him from her driveway, carrying a small bag, and mentioned she was going to visit her cousin in Detroit for a few days. Terrell knew immediately this was impossible. Denise had no cousins in Detroit. Her only relatives were Terrell himself in Chicago and her sister in Milwaukee, and both families talked constantly. But Chuck seemed so sincere, so worried, so eager to help. He even offered to assist Terrell in searching through Denise's belongings, looking for any clue about where she might have gone. The police took Chuck's statement and filed their report. Missing person, likely voluntary departure. Case priority, low. Terrell knew they were wrong, but he had no idea just how wrong they really were. What happened next is where this case becomes absolutely heartbreaking on a completely different level, and I need you to prepare yourself for what you're about to hear, because it's going to disturb you in ways you never expected. Terrell Washington became completely obsessed with finding his mother. He took extended leave from work, hired 4 different private investigators, and spent his entire life savings on search efforts. He created missing person flyers with Denise's photo and distributed them across 5 states. He maintained a website called FindDeniseWashington.com that documented every lead, every possible sighting, every tiny clue. But here's the twist that makes this story so much more disturbing than anything you could imagine. Chuck Mitchell became Terrell's strongest ally in the search. Every single week for 15 years, Chuck would call Terrell with updates. He helped organize neighborhood search parties. He contributed significant money to the reward fund. When Terrell felt like giving up, Chuck would be there with encouragement and new theories about where to look. Chuck even maintained Denise's garden while she was missing. Every spring, he would plant new roses, trim the bushes, and keep the yard looking exactly like Denise would have wanted. Neighbors would comment on how touching it was that Chuck honored his missing friend this way. During those long summer evenings, Terrell would sit on his mother's front porch, and Chuck would join him. They'd talk about Denise's habits, her personality, places she might have gone. Chuck had this incredible memory for details about Denise's life. He could remember conversations they'd had, places she'd mentioned wanting to visit, people she'd talked about. Terrell later said that Chuck became like a father figure to him during those dark 15 years. When his own hope was fading, Chuck's unwavering belief that Denise was out there somewhere kept him going. The neighborhood changed around them. Young families moved in, attracted by the quiet streets and mature trees. Chuck would always make sure to tell newcomers about Denise's disappearance, asking them to keep an eye out for any information. He became the unofficial keeper of Denise's memory on Maple Street, and all the while the truth was hidden just 25 feet away from where Terrell sat crying for his mother. Fast forward to September 2024. Chuck Mitchell, now 77 years old, decided it was time to renovate his basement. His grandchildren were visiting more frequently, and he wanted to create a comfortable family room where they could play and watch movies. Chuck hired Darius Thompson, a young contractor who had recently started his own renovation business. Darius was known for his meticulous attention to detail and his ability to spot structural problems that other contractors might overlook. The job seemed straightforward: expand the basement, install proper insulation, add built-in storage, and create a cozy entertainment space. Darius had been working for about 10 days when he noticed something that didn't seem right. One section of the basement wall looked different from the rest. The concrete appeared newer, slightly different in color, and it didn't match the building plans Chuck had provided. When Darius tested the wall with his equipment, he couldn't locate the electrical conduits that should have been running through that area according to the blueprints. When Darius mentioned this discrepancy to Chuck, the older man's reaction was bizarre. Chuck suddenly became nervous, almost panicked. He suggested they just work around that section, leave it alone, focus on other parts of the basement. But Darius was a professional who took pride in his work. He knew that ignoring potential structural issues could cause serious problems later. Against Chuck's increasingly desperate protests, Darius decided to break through the wall to investigate what was behind it. The first swing of his sledgehammer cracked the concrete too easily. It was thin, hastily poured, not the thick foundation wall it appeared to be. The second swing opened a hole large enough for Darius to shine his flashlight inside. What he saw in that narrow beam of light made him drop his tools and stumble backward in absolute terror. Behind that false wall was a small, cramped space, no bigger than a walk-in closet, and curled up in the corner, still wearing a faded purple nightgown, were the skeletal remains of an elderly woman. Darius immediately called 911, his hands shaking so violently he could barely dial the numbers. Within 45 minutes, Maple Street was swarming with police cars, ambulances, crime scene investigators, and news vans. The quiet suburban street that had spent 15 years wondering about Denise Washington's fate was about to learn the most horrifying truth imaginable. The forensic team worked for 4 days straight, carefully documenting every detail of the makeshift tomb. What they discovered was so disturbing that even veteran homicide detectives had trouble processing it. The remains were quickly confirmed to be those of Denise Washington through dental records. But the medical examiner's preliminary findings revealed something that transformed this from a missing person case to one of the most heinous murders in Illinois history. Denise hadn't died from a heart attack, a stroke, or even a violent assault. She had been entombed alive. The evidence was unmistakable and absolutely heartbreaking. Scratch marks covered the concrete walls, desperate claw marks where Denise had tried to break free. Her fingernails were worn down to nothing from scraping against the rough concrete. The medical examiner estimated that Denise had survived in that horrible space for anywhere from 8 to 20 hours before succumbing to suffocation. But here's where the investigation took an even darker turn, one that would shock investigators to their core. Police immediately focused on Chuck Mitchell. After all, the body was found in his basement, behind a wall that he had clearly constructed himself. But Chuck's reaction to the discovery seemed genuine. He appeared shocked, horrified, completely bewildered by the finding. Darius was known for his meticulous attention to detail and his ability to spot structural problems that other contractors might overlook. The job seemed straightforward. Expand the basement, install proper insulation, add built-in storage, and create a cozy entertainment space. Darius had been working for about 10 days when he noticed something that didn't seem right. One section of the basement wall looked different from the rest. The concrete appeared newer, slightly different in color, and it didn't match the building plans Chuck had provided. When Darius tested the wall with his equipment, he couldn't locate the electrical conduits that should have been running through that area according to the blueprints. When Darius mentioned this discrepancy to Chuck, the older man's reaction was bizarre. Chuck suddenly became nervous, almost panicked. He suggested they just work around that section, leave it alone, focus on other parts of the basement. But Darius was a professional who took pride in his work. He knew that ignoring potential structural issues could cause serious problems later. Against Chuck's increasingly desperate protests, Darius decided to break through the wall to investigate what was behind it. The first swing of his sledgehammer cracked the concrete too easily. It was thin, hastily poured, not the thick foundation wall it appeared to be. The second swing opened a hole large enough for Darius to shine his flashlight inside. What he saw in that narrow beam of light made him drop his tools and stumble backward in absolute terror. Behind that false wall was a small, cramped space, no bigger than a walk-in closet, and curled up in the corner, still wearing a faded purple nightgown, were the skeletal remains of an elderly woman. Darius immediately called 911, his hands shaking so violently he could barely dial the numbers. Within 45 minutes, Maple Street was swarming with police cars, ambulances, crime scene investigators, and news vans. The quiet suburban street that had spent 15 years wondering about Denise Washington's fate was about to learn the most horrifying truth imaginable. The forensic team worked for 4 days straight, carefully documenting every detail of the makeshift tomb. What they discovered was so disturbing that even veteran homicide detectives had trouble processing it. The remains were quickly confirmed to be those of Denise Washington through dental records. But the medical examiner's preliminary findings revealed something that transformed this from a missing person case to one of the most heinous murders in Illinois history. Denise hadn't died from a heart attack, a stroke, or even a violent assault. She had been entombed alive. The evidence was unmistakable and absolutely heartbreaking. Scratch marks covered the concrete walls, desperate claw marks where Denise had tried to break free. Her fingernails were worn down to nothing from scraping against the rough concrete. The medical examiner estimated that Denise had survived in that horrible space for anywhere from 8 to 20 hours before succumbing to suffocation. But here's where the investigation took an even darker turn, one that would shock investigators to their core. Police immediately focused on Chuck Mitchell. After all, the body was found in his basement, behind a wall that he had clearly constructed himself. But Chuck's reaction to the discovery seemed genuine. He appeared shocked, horrified, completely bewildered by the finding. He forced Denise into the small storage alcove he had been using for holiday decorations. While she pleaded for her life, while she promised over and over that she wouldn't tell anyone, Chuck began mixing concrete. Denise begged him to reconsider. She talked about Terrell, about how much she loved her son. She talked about all the good times they'd shared as neighbors. She even offered to give Chuck money if he would just let her go. But Chuck was beyond reason. He sealed Denise inside the tiny space while she was still conscious, still begging, still promising to keep his secret. Then, in a move that left even seasoned investigators stunned, Chuck went back to Denise's house. He packed an overnight bag to make it seem like she'd gone on a short trip. He cleaned up the kitchen and made sure everything looked perfectly normal, like nothing had ever happened. and then he began his 15-year performance as the concerned neighbor helping to search for his victim. What makes Chuck Mitchell's crime so uniquely horrifying isn't just the murder itself, it's what he did afterward for 15 long years. Chuck Mitchell maintained one of the most chilling facades in criminal history. Every single day, he comforted Terrell Washington while knowing exactly where his mother was buried, just 25 feet beneath the garden they both tended together. Chuck didn't just participate in the search for Denise Washington, he orchestrated it. He helped organize search parties that he knew were destined to fail, carefully directing volunteers away from his own property. He contributed his own money to reward funds for information he knew no one would ever find, creating an elaborate performance of concern and desperation that fooled an entire community. Perhaps most disturbing of all was Chuck's meticulous care of Denise's garden. What the community saw as a beautiful tribute to her memory was actually something far more sinister. Chuck would spend hours each week tending to the flowers and plants that grew directly above Denise's decomposing body. Neighbors would often comment on how the garden seemed to flourish under Chuck's care, never suspecting the horrific reason why the soil was so fertile. Chuck would smile and say that Denise's spirit was helping the plants grow, a statement that now takes on a nauseating double meaning. Terrell would often join Chuck in the garden, helping to water plants and pull weeds, unknowingly kneeling just feet from his mother's remains. Chuck would use these moments to share fabricated stories about conversations he claimed to have had with Denise about her love for gardening and her dreams of traveling the world. During those long evening conversations on Denise's porch, Chuck perfected his role as the concerned neighbor and family friend. He would arrive with a cup of coffee and a new theory about where Denise might have gone. His stories became increasingly elaborate over the years, tales of Denise mentioning distant relatives in other states, or expressing interest in starting fresh in a new city. Chuck's manipulation was methodical and calculated. Child psychologists who later studied the case identified his behavior as psychological sadism, the deliberate infliction of mental suffering for personal gratification. Chuck didn't just kill Denise Washington, he tortured her son for 15 years, feeding off Terrell's pain while presenting himself as a source of comfort and support. What made Chuck's deception particularly cruel was his apparent ability to read Terrell's emotional state. On days when Terrell seemed ready to give up, Chuck would suddenly produce a new lead or a fresh theory. When Terrell began to lose hope, Chuck would remind him of his mother's unwavering love and how disappointed she would be if he stopped searching. The depth of Chuck's manipulation only became clear when investigators examined phone records from the 15-year period. The numbers were staggering. Chuck had called Terrell over 400 times, always with updates on the search, always with encouragement, always with false hope. These weren't brief check-ins. Call logs showed conversations lasting hours, with Chuck carefully maintaining his role as Terrell's primary source of emotional support. He would call after every failed search, after every dead-end lead, after every moment when Terrell's hope began to waver. Chuck's deception extended far beyond his relationship with Terrell. He had become a fixture in the community as the neighbor who never gave up searching for Denise. He attended every memorial service, comforted Denise's church friends, and participated in annual vigils marking the anniversary of her disappearance. Local news stations featured Chuck in multiple stories about the ongoing search for Denise Washington. In one particularly chilling interview from 2018, Chuck looked directly into the camera and said, "I won't rest until we bring Denise home. That family deserves answers, and I'll keep searching until we find them." Chuck had inserted himself so completely into the narrative of Denise's disappearance that some community members later admitted they had begun to see him as almost saintly, a man whose dedication to finding his neighbor had become legendary in their Chicago suburb. Dr. Michelle Rodriguez, a forensic psychologist who consulted on the case, described Chuck's behavior as one of the most extreme examples of psychological manipulation she had ever encountered. Most killers try to distance themselves from their crimes, Dr. Rodriguez explained. Chuck did the opposite. He maintained intimate contact with his victim's family, not out of guilt or remorse, but because he derived satisfaction from their pain. Chuck Mitchell's trial began in March 2025, and it quickly became one of the most closely watched cases in Illinois history. The courthouse had to implement a lottery system for public seating due to overwhelming interest from true crime enthusiasts, journalists, and community members who couldn't believe the level of deception involved. The prosecution's case was overwhelming from the start. They had physical evidence linking Chuck to the crime, a detailed confession that matched perfectly with the evidence, and a timeline that accounted for Chuck's movements in October 2009. But what really sealed Chuck's fate and what captured the public's attention was the testimony about his 15 years of psychological manipulation. Day after day, witnesses took the stand to describe Chuck's elaborate performance. Friends testified about his seemingly genuine concern for the Washington family. Church members recalled his emotional contributions to prayer circles dedicated to finding Denise. Volunteers described his tireless participation in search efforts, always volunteering for the areas farthest from his own property. The most devastating moment of the trial came when Terrell Washington took the stand to deliver his victim impact statement. The courtroom fell completely silent as Terrell walked to the witness stand, his hands visibly shaking. Terrell talked about the nights he couldn't sleep, wondering if his mother was cold, hungry, or afraid somewhere. He described the guilt that had consumed him for 15 years. Guilt about not being a better son, guilt about not finding her sooner, guilt about the arguments they'd had before she disappeared. "He stole 15 years of my life," Terrell said through tears that seemed to echo throughout the silent courtroom. "Every time I felt like giving up, he would tell me to keep looking. He would remind me how much my mother loved me, how she would want me to never stop searching. And all the time he knew she was dead. He knew because he killed her." Terrell described how Chuck's unwavering faith that Denise was still alive had been the only thing that kept him from completely giving up hope. On the darkest days when Terrell wanted to stop searching, Chuck would appear with a new theory, a new place to look, a new reason to believe. "I trusted him completely," Terrell continued. "When I couldn't afford to continue the search, he offered to help pay for it. When I wanted to hire a private investigator, he helped me research which one to choose. When I talked about giving up, he would remind me that my mother was counting on me to never stop looking for her." The impact of Terrell's testimony was immediate and profound. Several jurors were seen wiping away tears, and even court officers had to step outside to compose themselves. Chuck Mitchell sat motionless throughout Terrell's statement, showing no visible emotion. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with a unanimous guilty verdict on all charges. Chuck Mitchell was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 40 years for the psychological abuse inflicted on Terrell Washington. But the true impact of the Chuck Mitchell case extends far beyond the courtroom. It has become a case study in criminal psychology programs across the country, illustrating the devastating effects of long-term psychological manipulation. The case has also led to changes in how missing person investigations are conducted, with increased scrutiny of individuals who insert themselves too prominently into search efforts. For Terrell Washington, the end of the trial marked the beginning of a long journey toward healing. In interviews after the sentencing, Terrell spoke about the complex emotions he was experiencing: relief that the truth was finally known, anger at the years of manipulation he had endured, and a strange kind of grief for the man he had considered a second father. "I have to rebuild my entire understanding of the last 15 years of my life," Terrell said. "Every memory I have of that time period is tainted now. Every conversation with Chuck, every moment of comfort he provided, every piece of hope he gave me, it was all built on lies." The Chuck Mitchell case serves as a chilling reminder that sometimes the most dangerous predators are those who hide in plain sight, offering comfort with one hand while inflicting unimaginable cruelty with the other. It's a story that continues to haunt everyone who followed it, raising uncomfortable questions about trust, manipulation, and the darkest capabilities of human nature. As the case file was finally closed, Detective Patricia Johnson, who worked on the investigation, made a comment that perfectly captured the horror of what Chuck Mitchell had done. "We've seen a lot of evil in this job, but this was different. This wasn't just murder. This was 15 years of psychological torture, carried out with a smile and a helping hand. It's the kind of case that changes how you look at people forever." The house where Denise Washington lived has remained in the family. Terrell couldn't bear to sell it, but he also couldn't bring himself to live there. Instead, he's turned it into a memorial garden where the community can remember his mother's life and legacy. Chuck Mitchell's house was demolished immediately after his conviction. The lot where it stood has been turned into a small park with a bench dedicated to Denise Washington's memory. The basement where she was found has been filled with concrete and sealed forever. The case has become a subject of study for criminal psychologists around the world. Chuck Mitchell represents a rare type of killer, one who not only murders his victim, but then systematically tortures the victim's family for years while presenting himself as their greatest supporter. The Denise Washington case has changed how police departments across the country approach missing person investigations. The idea that a helpful neighbor or friend might actually be the perpetrator is now taken much more seriously by investigators. Detective Marcus Thompson, who worked on the case, explains, "We've learned that sometimes the people who seem most helpful, most concerned, most invested in finding the missing person are exactly the people we need to look at most carefully." Chuck Mitchell fooled everyone for 15 years, including trained police officers. Denise Washington is buried now in Chicago, next to her husband Raymond, in a cemetery where her beloved roses bloom every spring. Her headstone reads simply, "Beloved mother, friend, and neighbor, finally home." Terrell Washington visits the grave regularly, often bringing fresh flowers and stories about his new life. He says he still talks to his mother sometimes, telling her about the healing he's working toward and the foundation he started in her name. "I know she can't answer," Terrell says, "but I like to think she's proud of me for not letting Chuck Mitchell win completely. He took 15 years from us, but he didn't take everything. Mom's love, her memory, the person she was, that's still alive. And perhaps that's the most important lesson from Maple Street. Even the most calculated evil can't completely destroy love, hope, and the human spirit's ability to eventually heal." The Denise Washington case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and the communities we live in. It shows us that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Sometimes it hides behind friendly smiles, helpful gestures, and years of seemingly genuine concern. Chuck Mitchell's crime wasn't just murder, it was a master class in manipulation that lasted 15 years. He didn't just take Denise Washington's life, he stole 15 years from her son, robbed a community of its sense of safety, and perverted the very concepts of neighborliness and trust that hold communities together. But perhaps most disturbing of all, Chuck Mitchell's case shows us how someone can commit the ultimate act of betrayal while simultaneously positioning themselves as a source of comfort and support. He attended Denise's memorial services while her body was hidden in his basement. He maintained her garden as a tribute while knowing exactly why she would never return to tend it herself. The scratches on the walls of Denise's makeshift tomb tell the story of her final hours. Desperate, terrified, abandoned by someone she had trusted as a friend. But those same scratches also tell us something else. Denise Washington never stopped fighting. Even in her darkest moment, even when hope was gone, she kept trying to break free. That spirit, that refusal to give up, is something Chuck Mitchell could imprison but never destroy. And it's something that continues to inspire those who knew her and those who have learned her story. Chuck Mitchell remains in prison, where he will spend the rest of his life. He's become something of a celebrity among true crime enthusiasts, receiving hundreds of letters from people fascinated by his ability to deceive an entire community for 15 years. But for the people whose lives he destroyed, Chuck Mitchell isn't a fascinating criminal. He's a reminder that the greatest betrayals often come from those we trust the most. Terrell Washington has slowly begun to rebuild his life. He's working with a therapist who specializes in complex trauma and has started a foundation dedicated to helping families of missing persons navigate the psychological challenges of long-term searches. "I'm learning to live with what happened," Terrell said in his most recent interview. "I'll never get over it completely, but I'm trying to build something positive from all this pain. Mom would want me to find peace again. The house on Maple Street where this nightmare unfolded looks different now. The memorial garden blooms with Denise's favorite roses, and visitors often stop to pay their respects. New families have moved into the neighborhood, and life has returned to something resembling normal. But the people who lived through the Denise Washington case know that normal is forever changed. They've learned that the person who offers to help might have darker intentions. They've learned that the neighbor who seems most concerned might be the very person responsible for the tragedy. Most importantly, they've learned that evil doesn't always look like our worst nightmares. Sometimes it looks exactly like someone we trust. The Denise Washington case will continue to be studied, discussed, and remembered as one of the most psychologically complex crimes in American history. But beyond its value as a case study, it serves as a reminder to hold our loved ones close, to trust carefully, and to remember that sometimes the most ordinary looking people are capable of the most extraordinary evil. Denise Washington deserved better than the death she received in the 15 years of lies that followed. But her story, as horrific as it is, serves a purpose now. It reminds us to stay vigilant, to trust our instincts, and to never stop fighting for the truth, no matter how long it takes to surface. Because in the end, the truth always finds a way out from behind even the strongest walls. If this story affected you as much as it did me, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into cases that show us the importance of never giving up on justice. And before you go, I'm curious to know where you're watching from today. Whether you're tuning in from New York, London, or somewhere else entirely, I love connecting with viewers from all around the world. Until next time, stay aware of your surroundings, trust your instincts, and remember, the people closest to us aren't always who they seem to be. Thanks for joining me on this journey, and stay safe out there.